I used to read the Rama series when I was a kid. I thought
Love
that
that
was a
book.
great series. I read it many
Yeah,
times.
yeah, yeah.
So I really appreciate their naming here. What do you have you read this paper, and is that of interest to you at all?
No, I haven't read the paper. I have to say, Rama, Rendezvous with Rama is one of my favorite Arthur C. Clarke books. That book was so great and was so exciting. And then, when we had uh, uh, um, the comet pass through, Oumuamua pass through, everyone was like, "Oh my God, it's Rama!"
Yeah,
Didn't
that
quite
was
turn
my
out that
first
way,
thought as
but
well.
right, right. But sooner or later, maybe, right? Even if I don't think Oumuamua was, but because we just don't have the data to tell. But certainly we should be looking. So, but the idea of might we see the consequences of their acceleration mechanisms of their starcraft? Absolutely, right? And so, in a bunch of different ways, we might be able to see something like that if they're using some kind of a super advanced gravitational drive. Maybe we'd be able to pick that up with LIGO. If you started to see anomalous kinds of signals like that, maybe that would be on your list of like, we don't understand what this is. Could it be, a techno signature? But even in light, right? What we are already pursuing the idea of driving spacecraft up to close to the speed of light using phased array laser arrays, right? This is the breakthrough Starshot, which I think is a very interesting idea. You have a light sail, you have this giant laser that you hit the light sail with the light from the laser, and you can accelerate it up to close to the speed of light pretty quickly. If that was a common way of propelling spacecraft around, even around solar systems, let's say you've got a civilization that has landed, has settled most of its planets, and they're moving things back and forth with these laser arrays. Maybe we'd catch one, like as they're just driving a spaceship with this laser, but the laser passes in front of our telescopes. So that's another interesting possibility people have talked about, that you catch the flares that, right now our telescopes aren't really there, but over time we will have the ability. And we now have a lot of telescopes that are looking for transient features. And maybe that's something that's going to show up in the transient telescope searches.
Where does your gut tell you? Where does the line draw? So, we'll get into UAP here in a little bit, but
Mm-hmm.
I know that's a topic you have expressed some opinions on, and we'll talk about them. But where do you draw the line between the, I guess you could call it disconnect. Maybe it's not a disconnect, but maybe it's a connection between how quickly we're developing these capabilities in our society to detect things around us and to expand our understanding and to send probes and information to other places in the universe. And we've done that in such a small amount of time. What's the big thing that's, the break in your gut that's saying, hey, nothing could come here? That's that's a much lower probability based off how
Yeah.
fast we can see technology advance and how we're now
Right.
seeing and searching for other life out there.
Right. Right. That's a really good question, Ryan. So this is one of the things that's a part of what I'm trying to explain in the book about sort of, there's my gut, but there's also, the processes of science that anything we talk about when we're talking about aliens, we have to try as best we can to take, as I always like to say, science is constrained imagination, right? We can reach amazing heights with our speculation, but it's got to be we have to try to ground it into the laws of physics and chemistry and and biology that we understand, even if we're extrapolating. Because the thing is, we know a lot of science, right? And it may be that there's lots more science to find out there, but it's still going to have to sit on top of the science that we understand. So the disconnect can happen, as you say, when the speculation sort of like untethers itself from the kind of systematic way you have to apply the laws of physics and the laws of the universe to any problem you want to take on. How do you go about exploring the unexplored in a way that keeps your feet on the ground, right? Because you want to have an open mind, but as they say, you don't want your mind to be so open that your brains fall out. So that's the trick. That's the line we're trying to walk, especially as scientists in the scientific search for this. So as we can talk about this, I'm involved in some parts of what we call solar. It's called solar system set, right? Has a previous civilization perhaps passed through the solar system and left something, right, that we could find? So I'm literally right now involved in a project where we're calculating how long would you be able to see. This is one way to phrase the question. How long would the lunar lander be visible? If you were taking pictures of the moon once every million years, how long would that lunar lander show up in those pictures? And so you got to do the detailed calculation of micrometeorites, hitting the. And the reason we're doing this is because, yes, I think it's possible, that somebody passed through and left artifacts someplace. So then the question becomes, are they here now? And that, it's possible. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying that what you then have to ask is, why now? Why in this brief window that we're here? How many, times has it happened? And so it's that where we start to form a disconnect, but also it can inform how we go about doing the search, right? I'm very happy that NASA is having these searches. I'm skeptical that as we'll talk about. But skepticism doesn't mean no. It just means like this is the kind of data that we'll need. So let me just finish this point on one. So one of the weird things about thinking about life in the universe, right? We've got 400 billion stars in the Milky Way. But if a civilization only lasts, say, 1,000 years, let's say the average lifetime for a technological civilization is 1,000 years, it means it's really easy for the galaxy right now to be sterile. There may have been lots of old civilizations that are gone now, but there might not be anybody around right now. And so that's really that's one of the things you have to think about. It depends on how long-lived civilizations are. And if they're not super long-lived, then, we just, in our little window while we're here, there's nobody else around.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, but have you at any point faced any stigma from your colleagues or those that you respected because of your interest in technosignatures or pushing that part of the conversation forward scientifically into the mainstream?
Remarkably, no, and that's been gratifying. But I've been watching a real transition in the community. As I talk about in the book, the reason why SETI was marginalized in the scientific community for two reasons. One was it was way ahead of its time. The methods that you had, as I explained, were you had to be looking for someone sending you a signal. And some people rightfully said, well, what are the odds of that? What assumptions do you have to say that someone's actually trying to send you a signal? But the other reason was because of what happened with the culture of UFOs, because of what happened, the history of UFOs, as I talk about in the book, there unfortunately was a lot of conspiracy theory mongering and a lot of hoaxes, and the SETI effort got tarred with that. So in the 80s and in the 90s, NASA tried to fund SETI, tried to really have a big SETI project, and a bunch of Congress people got up on, in the floor of the Congress and said, we're not going to waste any taxpayers' dollars searching for little green men. So we call that in the field the giggle factor. There's been this giggle factor about searches for life in the universe, which unfortunately got tied, is linked to because the history of UFOs and how the discussion of UFOs has manifested. And so that's when I was a graduate student in the late 80s, that was clearly the way it is. But now, because of these revolutions I'm talking about in astrobiology, all these exoplanets we found, NASA's already funding the search for biosignatures. And now, I think because of our work, we're helping to push this along. It doesn't make any sense to put a lot of money into searching for biosignatures and then go like, no technosignatures. We don't even want to hear about it. So I think everybody's kind of recognizing that you're already doing this search anyway, include technosignatures. So now you have to figure out how to have a rational, systematic search for technosignatures.
So, I couldn't help notice, and what you just talked about, of course, but, the UFO conversation almost killed off the funding for SETI, I think is how you put it in the book.
Yeah.
The conversation has developed quite a bit since then. Do you believe that the current very public debate over UAP is a net benefit towards identifying what I'll just loosely call non-human intelligence instead of aliens and signatures of their existence, or is this discussion, in your view, a distraction?
I think it's important. People are interested. The thing about UFOs is people have always been interested, right? And so if somebody comes to me and says, I saw something in the sky, I can't explain, I can never tell them they didn't, right? I wasn't there. I don't know. The problem has been the way it has morphed into this thing where people, anything becomes evidence, right? Anything becomes, and it's not only just evidence, it's certainty, right? Because the whole process of science is you don't know. And you've got to figure out what's the best way to find out. And the problem with the history, well, again, there's been those hoaxes and such. But I think what's happening now, and I applaud what you've done. I think it's important that pilots are able to come forward and say, I saw something. It did this, right? Because that's the only way you're going to start a true scientific search about this. Now, as I said, I'm skeptical that these things have anything to do with non-human intelligence. But in the end, the only way you're going to be able to figure this out is to actually do, the same kind of science on that as we're doing on technosignatures. And because people are so interested in this, I think it helps. It helps people. This is the most important question humanity has ever faced. Are we alone, right? Are we the only time life has occurred in the whole universe? And, the last part of the book is really dedicated to why this question matters so much, that I think it's reasonable for people to want to know. It's reasonable for people to want science to turn to it. And I'm glad that the work that you've done, I'm glad that NASA is having that panel. I think that panel is going to help a lot. And, over time, we'll get some answers. And as you've said, as I've seen you said, whether it's, airline safety, whether it's a national security issue, or whether it's something more, there's enough going on that it's worth doing the study.
What do you think of the the videos that the government released? I'm baiting you, not baiting you, but I'm encouraging you to at least talk a little bit about how. I'm going to find the quote here. Yeah, you said that a major problem with the government UAP videos is that they come pre-digested, already edited by someone, including the audio, and assumed to be real. I thought that was an interesting quote in your book, because essentially that's why I came forward. I came forward to talk about what else was seen on the radar system, to kind of backfill a little bit on who the pilots were, and to be able to tell a story from the perspective of someone, that was there, and that, can talk to the pilots about this. I agree with you that we were essentially preconditioned to think certain ways about those videos.
Right.
I don't know who named those videos. It certainly wasn't the pilots, but, all we really know is that the tapes came. The public knows that the tapes came out. They're named a certain way, and everyone assumed that meant something or the other. It's by my coming forward, it was my hope to try to provide some clarity and some honesty to what that situation was, from the people on the ground that were dealing with it. Do you think that we can really ever have an honest conversation in a way that will satisfy people if we are involving the government in this conversation? If it's not an open science conversation, is there a path there?
I think that's going to be very hard. I think it's going to be very hard because, there's ways in which I understand from the military's perspective. Like, if these are like, these super advanced electronic signals intelligence devices, you don't really want people to know what they can do, right? You don't want your peer state adversaries to know what they do. And at the same time, the government being the government, and of course, right, there's no one government, right? There's lots of different divisions. I had a company one time. I had an educational software company, and I remember dealing with a big publisher, right? They had many divisions, and I remember trying to convince these guys to do something, and they realized that their enemy was not the other publishers; it was one of the other divisions within their own company, right? And so, these big organizations, I think it can be very hard to get anybody to ever do anything, release anything, to ever be transparent, because everybody's concerned about their own, reputations or whatever. So I think you're right in the sense that I think we got to get our own data. Right? The only way forward on this is to say, let's get our own data. Take some of the, take some money, hopefully not from science, get it from somewhere else because we're already scrapped for cash. But let's take some money, and that's why I have that chapter in the book where I say, if you wanted to do a true, transparent, fully transparent scientific search to understand UAPs, here's how you do it, right? Now you had it, sort of laid out what a strategy for having this kind of investigation would look like. So I kind of agree. I think you're always going to be going down the rabbit hole if you're trying to get the government to release stuff. So let's just do it ourselves, right? Let's just, like NASA, NASA will be transparent about it. NASA is transparent about everything it does. So let's, build the instruments, show people how we're doing it, and see what we get.
I'm sure there's going to be some kickback from the words that came out of your mouth that NASA is transparent about everything, including by those that work at NASA. But we'll see how that plays out in real
Well,
time.
you know, in the sense of how the science works, right?
Sure.
I mean, this, I've worked with people with the Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Space. I've worked on, the science, how those instruments are built, how they're calibrated, how the analysis was done. That stuff's all in the papers, right? If I want to know how the JWST filters infrared light in between, this wavelength and that wavelength, it's all in the literature. I can find everything I need to do. And also the transparency here is that it's not NASA going to be writing the scientific papers. It's going to be scientists writing the scientific papers. And, if you're not entirely transparent about what you've done, you're going to get shredded. I mean, what people have to understand is that science, we're mean to each other. We are very, very mean to each other, right? And there's this incredibly high standard about if you have data and you have a conclusion you want to reach with that data, the links between that have to be rock solid or you're going to get your butt kicked, right? There's nothing more terrifying than standing in front of like 10 people who are much smarter than you and having them interrogate you about the details of how you went about your business. So in that way, I think if we can, have this kind of set up this kind of scientific study, then it will be transparent.
I agree. There's some efforts that I'm involved with at the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics where we're looking to do just that.
Right.
And I'm eager to have more conversations on this podcast and at the conferences that we present at to talk about how we're trying to create a framework to be able to do exactly what you say, be able to bring repeatable data and results to this conversation so that people can follow the steps forward to either discovery or to nullified results. But either way, it needs to be done in a clean fashion. We need to respect the results of it. Here's a question. Garrett, you're someone that has been interested in studying this now professionally, pushing forward the edge of where we can see as a species, as a culture, and looking to see if there's anything else out there. I've been obviously involved with the UAP conversation, and for me, it's a different conversation. It's more agnostic in a sense. I don't know what these objects are or where they are, but there is a large cultural swell around it to say these things are quote unquote aliens from another planet. I don't know how to make that leap. I don't know what that necessarily means, right? We see these objects are unknown. They have performance characteristics. That's really where the chain ends for me and where I'm still trying to find answers about. But one thing I've seen a lot pop up from NASA and from the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office and others is a common phrase they say, which is usually it's at the beginning of the presentation where they say they have seen no evidence that anything unexplained had an extraterrestrial origin. And I've always thought that was an interesting statement that they seem to make definitively, which is fine because you can't prove the absence of information in a sense. But, what information or what evidence would be needed to assess an object of, we'll just call it unknown technological origin and conclude with a high degree of certainty that is the creation or agent of some species that evolved on another star system and traveled here by unknown means? I mean, that's really what we're talking about if we break it down. What parameters would be evaluated to make that conclusion? Is this a question we can even answer? Is it a material science question? Is it a point of origin estimation? I mean, where would we even begin to answer that question?
God, that's a really good question. And so I think, and I talked a little bit about in my chapter about the how we'd actually carry out a UAP search. It's a couple different things. As you said, one thing is just give me a piece of metal, or whatever. Give me an artifact that I can take to the lab and say, like, this is not any element we've ever seen before, right? This is, that would be great. And then you could take it to like 10 different labs and we'd all, every lab would look at it and use different methods. And then they publish results in the scientific literature, which would be peer reviewed and everybody would yell and scream and argue about it. But in the end, we'd be able to conclude, conclusively, we'd be able to tell that this was just not anything that human technology had produced. Like that would be like the gold standard, right? Like what, there's Zorgonium in it. There's an element we don't even recognize, or there's some kind of, there's an alloy that has never been seen and has tensile strengths that are impossible by Earth standards. So that's one, right? That would be the best, right? Or a body, right? This idea of, the non-human biologics, which I'm not even sure what that word means. But, like if you had a organic specimen that was clearly different, those would all be like totally gold standard stuff. But if you don't have that, if you're just looking at, and this is probably if you're looking at UAPs, right? And if you build a sensor array, either on the ground or in the sky, and you're able to detect things moving through the sky at different wavelengths, because that's the important thing, right? You can't just like take a radar that was built for something else, that you don't have access to that instrument, right? What scientists do, like the JWST, we know everything about the JWST, right? Like we know how it performs when it's 10 degrees above zero and when it's 30 degrees above zero and everything in between. Like it's because that's the only way we can tell the quality of our data. So let's say you had instruments like that and you were tracking things in the sky at lots of different wavelengths from lots of different angles, and you saw something moving, say it made a right-hand turn at Mach 500, right? That would be good evidence that and you saw it multiple times and you saw it from, multiple cameras. That would be good evidence that there's nothing, this is beyond anything, human technology can do. So that's the kind of thing you'd be looking for. You know what's interesting about that though? Let's say you saw that and everyone's like, oh my God, there's something in the sky that is, what do you do next? Right? What would you do next? And some said you just have to do more science, right? Good science always leads to the next question. And so you'd have to do more science. And then you also have to ask, do we try and shoot one down? What do you do? But it's an interesting thing that even if you had that kind of data, as you say, you'd have evidence of something, but what would the next step be?
When you talk about that data, well, let me rephrase that. I don't know if you engage with your colleagues much on this topic, or if you've at least overheard their opinions on the UAP topic. But a lot of the times when I've engaged folks on this, there's always a lack of interest to look at data. It's always show me the data, show me the data. The first part of that is that, hey, we need to actually go gather data. We need to, determine the right sensor systems that should be used. We should build out a program so that we can have the proper dwell time over locations so we can get that corroborating evidence that you're talking about. We need to refine the sensors and be able to actually look at the raw data. Who's doing any of that work that would actually be required to come to an answer on this? The answer is no one really. So when you hear pushback or I guess the giggle factor, as you say on this, should we just not even engage in gathering more information? Is that a waste, or is this something that we should push past that giggle factor to engage science to get to an answer?
I think you're going to have to push back the giggle. I mean, the giggle factor. NASA, what is happening now with like the NASA panel or the Galileo project, those are first steps of people trying to build out the first step. So I think there is a transition, right? That people are beginning to be willing to pay attention to this. So, the NASA panel gave its report, and I think the conclusion is they're going to do more work. So it's a long process, I think. What we have to understand, and I think what people have to understand, is that, to be a scientist, to take on a new project, you don't just dip in and dip out, right? It's literally, you're betting your life. And because it's, to change topics, you're going to spend a year, 5 years, a decade. If you really, I've changed topics in my life a couple times. I started off studying how stars die, and then I switched over to how stars form. And now more recently, I've switched over to astrobiology. And it's years of commitment. So, I mean, sometimes people are like, well, why don't scientists just study this? Part of it is because the history with UFOs, sort of the shenanigans surrounding things like Roswell. I'm sorry, some of your viewers may get angry with me, but Roswell, no, that scientists are just like, you're asking me to spend decades of my life on something that's going to end up, I'm going to find out that somebody was hoaxing or that it was, the data wasn't very good. So, but I do think that now, and thanks again to the kind of things that, you and your colleagues have done, people are going to take it seriously enough that we'll start to do those scientific searches, that people will be, the people who were on that panel, the NASA panel, I know some of them, they were willing to they had to spend a lot of time. They took, a lot of time out of that year that they could have been studying things that are, that are of more immediate interest to them, like, exoplanets. So I think that's a good beginning.
I mean, I
Okay.
hear all the time from people, why should I care about this topic when I engage on the UAP topic? For me, my answer is very pragmatic, is that, I know colleagues that are reporting these and they don't have a way to deal with it or mitigate it as a safety risk. Um, do you ever have that question? Do people ever ask you, why does this matter? Why is this important? Why have you dedicated, such a large portion of your life to trying to answer the question to detect these signals? Why does it matter?
Yeah, it's a good question because I do get it sometimes. And my answer is it's literally the most important question human beings have. There's like two major questions that human beings have in the big picture. One is what happens after you die, and the other is, are we alone in the universe? And the second question matters because what's weird about humanity is we are alone in our own heads, right? And you look at human history and there's so much horror. We can behave so terribly towards each other. And then other times where, we have this angelic quality, we have altruism, and we can treat each other with such compassion. And you wonder, like, what's our problem? You know? And having just one example of another civilization or even life, right? Life, just finding any kind of life, because life is so different than non-life, right? Life is creative, it's innovative. To just know that we are not an accident, that the life on Earth and that human beings are not some kind of like cosmic one-off would tell us that there's possibilities out there, that maybe there are other ways of being, that there are other examples that we could follow. So I think this question speaks to the deepest issues and concerns we have as living creatures. What are we? Who are we? What are we supposed to be doing? And this question of life in the universe is like speaks directly to that. So if we were to find life in the universe, even if it was, through an indirect detection of biosignatures, it would fundamentally change our philosophical perspective about who we are. Just the way when we figured out with the Copernican revolution that it was the sun that was, the Earth went around the sun, not the other way around. That completely rewired our understanding. The question of are we alone is equally important.
A true paradigm shift. Well, Adam, I think that one of the most motivating things that we can do as a society is to essentially explore space and to look out there and see what else we can find. So I think you're doing absolutely fantastic work by being on that ledge and looking over to the other side for us. So I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. This was a great conversation. I also want to say the same thing for you. I appreciate the honesty and the courage that you had in coming forth and the way you've done it in a way that is, agnostic, because that's the right way for all of us to sort of approach these topics.
Thank you.